Texas became a republic. And they came up with all kinds of wonderful rules, our own constitution, all those wonderful things. And then in 1837, Texas did something that was revolutionary. They began to stop the importing of Africans for slaves. Now, when the word went out throughout the Caribbean that Texas had no longer allowed the importing of Africans for slaves, there was a slave captain of a great ship. He had left Africa with almost 600 people upon it, women, children, and men. When he arrived in the Caribbean, he sold off most of the women and children. He kept the men because he had a buyer off the Brazos River. You can't make those, you can't take those into Texas anymore, they told him. He said, oh, I'm going to take them. They're too valuable a cargo not to take. And he had his mind made up that he was going to take them. And slowly but surely he began to work his way from the Caribbean across the great Gulf of Mexico. Now Texas had formed a navy composed of 4 great ships: the Brutus, the Liberty, the Invincible, and the Independence. They had formed a blockade there in the great Gulf of Mexico. This captain was determined to make his run. Aboard his ship was a cabin boy whose task, the taking care of the slaves, had fallen to. He enjoyed taking care of them, if you would kind of put it like that. They really enjoyed when he would come, because he would put honey in the cornmeal before he poured the water in it, and he would take it down for them to eat. He would put a big bowl of it on the floor of the deck in the cargo hold, and then he would ring together 2 bells. He would ring those bells, and they would come and they would gather to eat. And they felt such joy in the small taste of a little bit of honey, until those men that were left, they were warrior men, and they would take their chains and flip them over, and they would beat on to show their joy. To them, this was an African concept called uhuru, freedom, freedom of mind and heart. No matter what the chains were, they would be free. And they would beat. And the rhythm was kind of like this. That was the rhythm that they would play. And they would beat with the chains and then stomp their feet over and over and over again. As they neared the coastline of Texas, they had not counted on the ingenuity of the Texas Navy. They had coast watchers all along the coastline, and when they turned their sails into the wind and began to go up the Brazos, a coast watcher lit the signal fire, and the Brutus was on duty. When the Brutus saw the signal fire, it turned its sails into the wind and began to pursue the slave ship up the Brazos River. As they went up the Brazos River, they cut loose with those cannons. The cannon walls began to flash, and the water began to fly over and over and over and over. They knew that there was no way they would escape the Brutus, for it was a warship. That old slaver had no chance. So they came up with an idea. It would be better to scuttle the ship, open the bottom up and let the water flow in, and escape on the longboats. Because they knew if they were captured, they would be hung by the neck until dead for the crime of piracy. When they began to scuttle the ship and jump into the longboats, the little cabin boy came up and he began to pull the hatches off of the cargo hold that held those men. They grabbed him. They told him, we don't have time to waste with them. But they're my friends, he said. They aren't friends, they aren't people, they're cargo. And they tossed him into a longboat. And And they began to row into the darkness, leaving the ship sitting there in the middle of the Brazos, slowly taking on water, sinking. Those men below decks found that bell, and they began to ring those bells, and they rang them louder and louder and louder. And by the time the boy was on the shoreline, he turned and he looked into the darkness, and he saw not the ship, but he only heard the bell. And it rang, and it rang, and it rang until it stopped. When it stopped, they were fleeing through. They were fleeing along the edge of the Brazos River. They had traveled for 2 or 3 days, and they were coming near a small town. And they knew that if they got into that town, they would be okay. They were sitting around a fire, deciding what they were going to do. And they had came to a pact that no one would tell who they were. But they turned and they looked at that little boy, and they realized that he was the weak link. If they were to be found and the truth be told, it would come from his lips, said the captain. His tongue will tell the tale. One of those pirates stood up and he pulled his long knife and he said, then he'll have no tongue. When the boy heard this, he looked up and he thought they were joking, just teasing him as they'd done before. But he saw the bloodlust in the eyes of the man as he got closer and closer and closer. And the boy jumped up and he started running. He ran into the darkness. And when he ran into the darkness, they all took off behind him because they knew that he was the weak link. If they were to be found out, he would be the one that would tell. And they began to run, chasing him through the dark forest. Faster and faster and faster he ran until he could no longer run. His chest began to heave and burn, and he fell there amongst the marsh. And when he fell there, he lay there and he could hear them getting closer and closer. And then all of a sudden, he heard. The slavers began to look around, wondering where the sound was coming from. The boy looked up and he watched, and then he heard the bell. And it rang. He heard the sound of the bell, loud and ringing. And it began to ring over and over and over again. He laid there in the hollow log that he slipped into, and he watched as they came out of the darkness. When they looked up, they looked into the burning dark eyes of men that had walked from the bottom of the Brazos River and began to fell upon them. They fell upon them. The boy lay there and watched his musket ball, rifle, and saber cut through the lifeless bodies of those that attacked. But they fell upon those pirates. They fell upon those slavers, and from them they ripped evil hearts, and they gouged out lying eyes, twisted tongues. And then all was quiet, except for the sound of the bell. They disappeared into the darkness. That boy never forgot what he saw, but he never told anyone either.